The Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship Program represents a rewarding academic professional development opportunity for faculty at Montgomery College. The fellowships are a product of a unique collaboration between Montgomery College and Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies. It's the first of its kind between the Smithsonian Institution and a community college.
Professor Lincoln Mudd was born in Washington, D.C. After graduating from high school, he worked in a number of trades, including roofer and catering chef. After initially studying printmaking, he received his MFA in sculpture. Beyond studio arts, he also worked in creative writing, poetry, and comparative literature. His sculpture practice includes a specialty in metal casting. He has attended numerous art residencies and received an Individual Artist Award from the Maryland State Arts Council in 2003.
First, I just have to say thank you to Manjula, wherever you are in India, for being such a good hostess down at the Smithsonian. And thank you to Sarah and Mimi for not only being participants in the fellowship, which they were, but shepherding us through. And I have to thank my fellows who are still here. I can't believe you're still here tonight, but whether you're here or not, because I think the fellowship experience has impacted my thinking and my teaching, but really the majority of it was the fellowship with my colleagues, which is what really made it. So thank you all. Tell me which one advances. Okay, good. I have to stand where I can see because I'm visual, so I have to see what you're saying. There's the title of our fellowship. You've heard about that. It's nice that if you stay here long enough, you hear how the presentations sort of piggyback on each other, and you see some commonalities, and then you see some different approaches. So I implemented this project in a combined Sculpture 1 and 2 class. The title of my project, which is slightly different from what it was going in, is Exploring Research Techniques for the Visual Artist. And if you were here when Vidya spoke, I liked what she said, which is you really shouldn't have an art studio class without a museum visit. You'd perhaps be deficient without it. So, you know, the idea of including museum studies in a studio art class is sort of self-evident. And Vidya talked about going down to look at design, formal aesthetics, the compositions that are there, maybe learning about specific artists, eras, and so forth, and certainly the ideas that are present in the work. The idea of my project was really to get my students to think about research contributing to the ideas, the complexity of ideas that they might want to express. So some of the things that going in were focal points of my project is just this idea that to come up with a complex or imaginative artistic creation entails more than just sort of a personal exploration. That's often part of it, and the artist sort of reflects things through their personal prism, but you have to engage in research outside of just your personal experience. The fact that viewing artworks, objects, artifacts that engage a broad range of issues, not only can you talk about that content and those issues, but the artists themselves have to understand that if I want to, for instance, make an artwork about environmental issues, I myself have to become educated about those issues. So that was a key component. I used the whole idea of critical encounter and cross-cultural exchange broadly. I didn't engage, for instance, I do not believe philosophically in telling my students what to make their artwork about. So I didn't give an assignment, for instance, saying we're going to do something on American identity. You know, I really think that those concepts, cross-cultural exchange, critical contact, I introduced as things that are critically important in contemporary art. If you're looking at art now, those are informing art all over the place. They're important for any number of reasons, so I use them broadly in that way. And then, of course, the museum visit, as we've heard already, offers this opportunity for group learning. I wanted to foster discussion and research of conceptual development. So not just looking at an artwork and talking about it per se, deconstructing it, but actually using the sort of ideas, the research, and the discussion that comes out of that to develop your own ideas. And then, of course, we want to actually see nice accomplished artworks. That's always a nice one. Going in, it's really important to think, how does that fit into an art studio curriculum? You know, what happens in a sculpture curriculum beyond, conceptual development? And there's this very critical thing when you're teaching art studio, but certainly sculpture, which is you got to learn about tools and materials. That sounds kind of simple. That's like, okay, we can do that. And then, of course, we want to develop concepts and ideas. So I would approach that, for instance, at the beginning of any semester, looking at a work like this piece, Conjoined by Roxy Payne, and talking about developing concepts, we might say ideation, and often in a visual arts studio, we think of things like making sketches and drawings, which is often part of what you want to do. So if I'm going to end up with an artwork that's sort of these two intertwined trees, some of the beginning might be going to nature and drawing from nature, studying a tree, maybe making an abstract gestural drawing, sort of trying to capture the energy of the tree. This whole idea that if I want to build this large piece in stainless steel and put it in a park in New York City, I have to learn how to work with steel, cut it up, weld it, things like that. But most importantly, that although I can talk about this piece by Roxy Payne in terms of its formal aesthetics, how beautiful it is, the movement of it, et cetera, that it didn't come about just because I was trying to make something pleasing to the eye. That Roxy Payne is really interested in this. He's made a whole series of these works. Some of you might have seen them. There's some down at the garden of the National Gallery, the sculpture garden. There's a piece, not this one, but a piece of this series down there, where he's talking about the organic and the industrial realm, feeding them into he says the organic and outside of the industrial realm, feeding them into an industrial system, and seeing what results from that force feeding. The end results are a seamless containment of these opposites. Now this is Roxy Payne talking about the work after he made it. But if my point to my students is, Roxy Payne has these ideas going on. He's not just saying, I'm going to make a stainless steel tree. Wouldn't that be neat? His ideas in terms of what is the industrial, what is the natural, how do those work together, and what happens. This is what we talk about in terms of conceptual development, is developing those type of ideas. I showed a piece of this at the end of our fellowship, and I can't just say tools and ideas and leave it there, because there's a lot of ways to approach that. I have a great sculpture studio. I have wonderful facilities, which means in a Sculpture 1 class, where there's no prerequisite that you've ever driven a nail in anything or used a drill or done anything like that. These are some of the things that you might get exposed to. The woodshop, okay, a full woodshop. Casting in metal. We have a foundry, we cast things in aluminum and bronze, and that's what we call process-heavy work. You don't just sort of end up with a casting in aluminum by throwing it off. That takes there's a lot of technical steps to that. We teach welding. So, in one particular semester, a Sculpture 1 student with no experience could be exposed to all these. And then, of course, I encourage students, because this is the way of sculpture now, to think of everything as potentially mixed media, meaning I'm not just going to teach you how to work in clay or carve stone or weld in steel. I'm going to work with you to develop an idea, and what tools and materials you use have to support the idea. That's where the function of the tools and materials comes. So wherever your ideas lead you, I want to expose them to a whole range of things how they might accomplish them. So again, sort of coming after my colleagues, in simplest terms, this idea of using the museum, what I think we all found is essential is it can't just be a one-off. It can't just be like a one-shot, we're going to go there, we're going to see this, and then we're done. So the way I approach this as a component in the conceptual development phase of the entire semester was to work it in something like this. Before we went on a museum trip, I gave them what I called a study packet, my students. This would include a reading and video. I gave a presentation in class. Some of that was a little bit on what they might see, but a lot of it was not. I wasn't showing you what you're going to see. I was showing you other things to talk about the ideas. We took the field trip to the museum. My sculpture students, and I do this in my design classes, and sometimes it's a shock because it's not an English class where they're expecting to write essays all semester. But I'm like, yeah, you're going to write a couple papers for me, like typed papers. Short, but, and I'm not going to grade them like an English teacher, but I need to see your thinking concrete, organized. You need to be able to develop your ideas and put them in that format. So they had to write a paper, and then we'd have a formal discussion where they had written the paper, and we'd have a discussion on it. Again, there are things that I think, with all of our experience, we would sort of say are essential positive outcomes from a museum field trip. One is just this idea of a shared experience. Again, the art studio tends to lend itself to collaboration and interaction. That's not always true in many disciplines, but the idea of having a shared experience, learning as a group, is a huge advantage. So many good things come out of that. Learning outside the classroom, just that idea that it doesn't begin when I walk in here and end when I go out of here. And going outside the classroom and continuing that journey is an incredibly positive outcome. The fact that there's so much different type of information in a museum, text panels, visual stuff, objects, artifacts. It's a sensory, it's not sensory overload. It's just, it is hitting so many senses, intellectual, visual, all of those. And then this is a place where students, because there is all this information, are able to make connections on their own, talk to each other, develop their own questions. In other words, it's a dynamic classroom, if we want to put it in those terms. So our first field trip was to the National Museum of African Art. One side note about that was interesting to me is that in my class, a sculpture class are 200 level, students should have some foundation in studio arts, and I actually did a little poll. This combined class was fairly small. Every person in that class had been to a museum, which I would say is not surprising, and it's different than some of my colleagues' experiences. However, very few of them had ever been to the National Museum of African Art. So that was a good place to start. And there was an assignment in terms of a writing assignment, and then there was a sort of concept for a sculptural project. My idea of those is that they were very open. They were not constrained. So I would ask open-ended questions. Cross-cultural exchange in history, the idea of history and culture was sort of my main focus going into the Museum of African Art. So I asked questions such as, what can be gained from a contemporary object having associations with history? How is history important and relevant now? In what way is history a disputed territory? Just talking about history in that type of terminology is, I would say, questionable. Why or how would referring to history be relevant? What evidence do you find of cross-cultural exchange? And one great thing about Museum of African Art, it has lots of artifacts, objects that are highly crafted. We talk about them as artwork. They were not made, a lot of them, with that thinking by their creator. They didn't think of themselves as an artist in the way we think of an artist in modern times. But it also has work of contemporary African artists. So it's a nice mix in terms of time period and so forth. And then just to give you a little sense again of, let's say, the entrance narrative, the preparation going into the museum visit. Here would be an example of the reading packet they had for that assignment. Some academic stuff, chapters out of academic books about constructing meaning. The words of an artist, John Duff, just not even an interview, just something him writing about his studio experience. Article from the Post, from the art section. Some video stuff on Yinka Shonibare. And then I would give an in-class presentation. So I would show them things like this Inkisi power object, which they were going to see some of. And they had a list of some things that they were required to see, like a scavenger hunt. And some of them I would have them say, think about this when you see these objects. So when they went there, there was a certain list of things they had to see, but the first thing on the list of the assignment was walk around, see everything, enjoy yourself, explore. So although I gave them nuggets to make sure they got around, I didn't say, just look at these things and then you're out of there. So I would show them some things that they were going to see, related pieces like this fetish by contemporary African-American artist Renee Stout, who's drawing literally on that tradition of the power object, the fetish, and talking about it in terms of contemporary feminine, African-American experience. In other words, she's bringing that tradition into her contemporary work, as well as somebody like Yinka Shonibare, a Nigerian artist who has done a lot of work with fabrics produced in the Netherlands for export to Indonesia that didn't sell and ended up selling in Africa and are associated with Africa but were produced in Europe. And he therefore took those cloths and started putting them into dresses in the European tradition. So he's just playing around with this sort of expectations, associations, stereotypes, this sort of cross-cultural exchange. Our second field trip was to the Hirshhorn Museum. In that case, I used this idea of critical connections, a lot more, in a way, a direct, understandable one. The African Art Museum thing, when I was talking about history and culture, was sort of like, whoa, that's a lot for like. I also took that field trip the second week of the semester. So we had 2 classes, and then we had Labor Day, and then we went to the, so I'm like, boom, we went down there, and I'm like asking them all these questions. I'm like, okay, make a sculpture thinking about that. And then we went to the Hirshhorn, and their assignment was just to walk around and look to see if they could make a connection between different artists. It was different artists sort of in dialogue with each other because of ideas that they're talking about or methodology. And the project was to choose an artist that they had never met. They had to have seen their work physically. And for them to actually become a collaborator with that artist, to have critical contact in that way. And this is one of the students meeting Peter Coffin's dog, Untitled. And so, for instance, again, the collection has a nice range. So they had to, on their list was this, very classic, important piece by Constantine Brancusi. So, I said I had a list. They had to see a Rodin, a Brancusi, and a Giacometti. And I'm like, so here's a little history of art and, the movement into modernism. But you're just going to see, I'm not teaching an art history class. And I'm not trying to construct it that way. But in other words, they had a series of works when they went to the Hirshhorn that sort of gave a historical approach. And then there were these temporary exhibits, one by Peter Coffin, one Jenny Jones, which was a piece that we couldn't photograph, which was a sound painting object installation room, which was, so they got this sort of wealth of experience. Following the museum visit, they had to do this writing assignment. We had a formal class discussion. Of course, they were engaged in making their own personal artwork. And then there's this idea of peer review and critique. So this would happen formally. In other words, in the art studio, there's a formal critique where they put out finished artwork, And they would be drawing on ideas. In other words, the idea of developing it, depending on who spoke and how they approached it, could be a commentary on what they got out of the museum in terms of an idea, an artist, a methodology, thinking that came out of that. And those discussions happen informally as well. It's one of the wonderful things about the art studio. It is a laboratory so that when people are working and they can speak to each other about these ideas and they can grow and fester and continue without having an essay or a formal assignment. It's very difficult, and in one way I sort of feel obligated to show you some artistic outcomes. And the only thing is that it's really important. The way I approach it with my students, for instance, when we went to the Museum of African Art, I said, your job is not to make something that looks like it came out of the Museum of African Art. So sort of drawing a direct arc in a parallel, here's our museum visit, here's the artwork that came out, is not really the way that I would judge these things. Nevertheless, here are some examples. So this is from National Museum of African Art exhibit. They had to look at some of these Nkisi power figures, fetishes. These have been given different sort of titles. And this student chose to write about, before the discussion, this wrapped figure. And she really was struck by how different it was from those Nkisi figures, that this figure had this wrapping. And she read on the wall text and did a little research and found that this tradition in Tanzania about how these wrapped objects were really involved in the healing arts. And that was really, this idea of those power objects that often has nails and other things driven into them in a very assertive and aggressive visually in a certain way. She was sort of taken by the contrast of this figure. And so she ended up making this piece. Again, not to emulate them and make a derivative art, but her idea of holding and wrapping and the healing nature of things. And this is what came out in this artwork. And I'm drawing a direct line, but some of these are from their comments. So also the same museum visit, Anasuya. This work is in the garden. There was one piece by him, Erosion, that they had to see. This was sort of extra credit. Can you find this? Because this was in the garden. I don't think this was required. And actually, the artist here is actually with us, one of my students, Suzanne. Thanks for coming. And so this is the work she created. And again, I don't want to draw too much of a direct lineage, but I'll read a little bit of Suzanne's words. The El Anasuya work, Allah, found in the outside sculpture garden, was a starting point for my first sculpture. Sitting on the bench, considering it, I began to think about enclosures and their purpose, how different an enclosure for protection is from an enclosure to contain. This became a seminal part of my piece composed of aluminum feathers and Lincoln logs. And I have to say that Suzanne started her research here, where it was an assignment, went to the National Museum of American Indian, continued there, and also drew on her own experience growing up out west and her experience in terms of Native culture and interaction there. So it wasn't just look at this and this comes out of it. It was it's personal history, it's research, sort of examining those type of issues. So for the Hirshhorn exhibit, this was really kind of interesting. One person chose these two artists as having a dialogue. And both of those are in the garden where they didn't have to go, but they could go, the sculpture garden. And this was the piece that came out of that. Mother Earth is something I think that was sort of the name given that in the critique when people are like, well, what are you, okay, we're going to look at the Mother Earth piece, but I think Danielle said, yeah, that's the name of it. And one of the interesting things about her comments about the two works, the Roxy Payne and the Miro, She said, the connection that I see between the two is that they both give off a very strong feminine personality. And that's fascinating. And her essay went into a lot more details, but she talked about the strength of how the tree was standing and how its branches were, and some of the imagery and associations in the Miro. But she had concerns of her own as a mother and a woman, and so that the manifest, and also she started out in the project wanting to talk about concerns of recycling and environment, which in a way, in part of the development was you can't talk about everything all in one sculpture. But these sort of things that were triggered in looking for a dialogue between these pieces, and I think many people looking at those two works would not start putting that connection together. So it's a highly personal thing in terms of how is research going to contribute to an individual artwork. And if we could, I don't know, can we turn out the lights for one instant? It'll turn off everything. Okay, that's too bad. So one nice thing, this is a Sculpture 1 student who ended up doing a video installation. And of course, for Sculpture 1, that's very ambitious, and that's nice to see. He was doing work in film, in a film class at the same time, so it represents direct, transdisciplinary. Not, you've learned something in painting, which, we can always talk about in sculpture. Well, you've learned something about color and color theory. You know something about painting from painting, so bring it in here and use it. But he was actually taking a class in film the same semester, and he was always interested. He wrote about a carved door by Aloy Iswe in the National Museum of African Art, and the fact that it was a door that was carved was so important. In other words, he was fascinated by the real object itself, not the illusion. And he ended up making a video installation titled Visits with Newly Born Protagonists that talked about how characters are created, how we look at people and sort of perceive them. It was very interesting in terms of, and he used his classmates and shot a lot of, a whole lot of different movies. And then he had all this very interesting text. And there's some parts of it that is kind of hard to see, but he built, a little guest book and a sign-in book on the wall. In other words, it was an ambitious project, and actually it very directly came out of, quite frankly, seeing Peter Coffin's work at the Hirshhorn, because he did a work that was a video overlaid onto paintings and so forth. But it was highly personal. So, okay, one last thing. And we all want to, although mine is in a writing class, we did give a survey. I did ask for feedback. And I'll say this about feedback. We always like to get feedback, but I would take, anytime you're giving students a class, and then you say, we're going to do this thing, how did you like it? What do you expect them to say? So, like with outcomes assessment. Like one assessment, I wouldn't overvalue or undervalue, but it's certainly wonderful for us to hear their voices. And for me, I didn't judge the success of the project just on a particular sculptural outcome. I think the potential that I saw was that the students genuinely sort of responded to ideation as an important, complex part of the work. That it isn't just learning how to cut something on the table saw, put it together, build it, make it look pretty so somebody can say, oh, that's good craftsmanship and it looks pretty. That the ideation part of it really, I think, genuinely took hold. So here are some of the things that students said. Follow-up discussions in class, as well as collaborative exchanges with fellow students and our professor while at the museums, added a deeper level of analysis and appreciation than I've ever previously experienced with an art museum visit. The field trip was very influential. It really helped me to generate creative ideas and apply them to my own processes. Loved the way the visits kicked off the assignments. Loved the difficulty level, meta thinking of the assignments. I think this adds a lot to the class, balances the physicality, technical side of sculpture with theory. And one last one. By combining the field trip with the roundtable discussion and the project concept, you pave the way for students to consider how they form ideas for pieces of art. By visiting a museum, students do not just see things to copy, but they become inspired to have their own voices be heard through their work. And that's it.